Welcome to the Lost Signals discusses philosophy, narrative, and the mechanics of criticism. In this show, we analyze the greatest minds of narratology, both classic and current. Enjoy.
And we're recording.
I don't think fuck you is a time frame.
5, 4, 3.
Hello and welcome to, I believe, one of the last of our plague themed.
We're winding down a bit.
Lost Signals episodes.
Yeah, wait to see what we're starting next month.
Yeah, the second wave. This is Lost Signals discusses philosophy of the plague and specifically popular culture reflections upon diseases. I am your Typhoid Mary, Jonathan Ian Manzer, here with the archer himself, Scott Thurlow.
Where are my coughs?
The paranoid maniac, Stephen Ramosi.
Hello.
A little too close to home, sorry. And our our isolated friend, Christopher Morgan.
Yeah, hey.
So we looked at 3 articles on art and plague. I'm going to list them off quickly, even though we're not going to be going in depth into those articles.
We'll link them though in the description, but the ones we read were
from Albert Camus to The Walking Dead, a look at pandemics and culture from The Guardian. What Plague Art Tells Us About Today from BBC. And The Art of Making Art About a Plague from Vanity Fair.
This is my favorite title.
Yes. But I kind of wanted to begin with looking more like a historical timeline throughout how art has handled diseases. I'm going to start with something not discussed in these works, the Iliad, which they had actually the archer raining down arrows upon the soldiers to represent sunstroke. Sorry, I just blanked on it. What's the god of the sun? Apollo. Apollo raining down arrows to represent that disease. And oftentimes, and this goes into where we're really starting with the Black Plague, is that oftentimes disease was linked to punishment by gods throughout history.
Sure. Yeah.
And this goes into many of the articles that are dealing that a lot of the Black Plague dealt with repentance and punishment from God as
via like a religious angle, like more or less. Yeah.
So does anyone have anything to talk about with that?
With excuse me, with God and or gods bringing down plagues to I was thinking, the one thing that I kept thinking about, especially with the second article that really went through history, was that these Old Testament gods, let's say, were just such magnificent pricks. Then if they were actually real, if these motherfuckers actually exist, there would be no doubt about it. They wouldn't bring AIDS or anything upon the world. These fascist bitches would let us know right away. Sorry, I didn't mean to use the B word. These things would not have. So like I see things like that. I hear, and I know it's part of history, and I know yada yada yada. But by the same token, I see this stuff and it makes me insane.
But when you're dealing with comprehension of a almost unknowable destructive force, it's easy to ascribe it to a power outside of human control.
Yeah.
And people, I firmly believe that people desire control in their lives. So it's easy to say that it's not, it's easy to ascribe it to something greater than yourself for a destructive force rather than chaos.
Well, I mean, yeah, I'm just saying, but what you were saying back then and its use today is basically what I'm getting back to, is because this kind of bullshit has not ended in 10,000 years.
Psychological condition of ascribing to something beyond yourself has not changed.
So it's like, I appreciate what you're saying, and I didn't really mean to like swear on your point, but I hear this because to me, it's just like that, for lack of a better word, argument, that justification, that excuse is still prevalent today,
Yeah, I mean, like
all the fucking time.
and just
And-
quickly,
Like I said, I understand you're putting it in a historical thing. And so when you ask, do I have anything to say? I'm like, well, let me just puke this out right now to get
Well,
it
you
over
can have a
with.
modern interpretation of ancients' desire to control their world. But-
sure, but I mean, I mentioned it like on a previous episode, like in the recent like month or so. Like, yeah, especially because in history, going back to like times like that and the Roman times and like the Middle Ages,
Mhm.
right? There was a very large religious like mindset. So that's what society attributed to, as you mentioned, because of lack of other explanation, which I think even still reverberates throughout history, even to modern times to a degree. But because of such a daunting like thing of trying to subscribe, I guess, as you said, like a villainous face upon something, even if not that, it's just that they had to describe it or had to explain it in some way. So religion was an easier answer, like, oh, we're being punished because of this and that, because of the way that religion was, ingrained in society in those historical periods. So that's all I just wanted to add.
Yeah, I mean, to both of your points, I think that's still the case. Some people still ascribe it to not necessarily like individual punishment, but like that we're getting a plague because God is angry with us and things like that.
Oh,
Like,
you'll see pastors discussing how the punishments for homosexuality and things like that in our society.
Insert societal issue here. Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. And I think I think that is something that hasn't changed. You're right, Chris. And I'm not sure it ever will. Like, to some degree, humanity, as long as we exist, are going to be the same psychologically in a lot of ways,
Well, actually, one of the interesting parts I thought about this was the transition. So I introduced the Greek gods into this, where because there's a pantheon, you could the Greeks tended to ascribe or to put more human features into their deities, versus the benevolent, single, monotheistic religion of Christianity. Versus when the article they discussed the Japanese response to smallpox, where they had the samurai fighting the smallpox demons.
The demons, yeah.
What's interesting is that some of the I believe Renaissance art dealing with the Black Plague, it wasn't God himself that cast this plague upon it, but it was demons that were acting on his behalf to punish humanity. And it's interesting to me how when there are multiple gods, we were allowing that God to have fault. But when when the society believed in a single benevolent God, he couldn't be at fault himself.
Yeah. Contracted to work out.
Yeah,
exactly, Steve. I believe one of the articles is as if God himself subcontracted the work of the plague to the demons. Therefore, like it was via that was indeed the vector, if you will, in which it was spread. Yeah.
Well, you know how I'm a big fan of Voltaire. When he was transitioning to an atheist, he actually wrote a lot of works trying to say, well, I'm justifying fault in our world not on behalf of God, but on behalf of other demons that caused issues. And it was it's an interesting transition in a culture as it proceeds through how it handles gods.
Yeah.
But let's move onwards to more modern day. So I thought this was fascinating. I'm an Anglophile. I'm into British culture quite a bit. And I got recommended through Google, of all places, a BFI article that introduced Dr. Wise and Influenza, which is a fascinating look at, do you actually want to talk about Chaucer and all that?
I was going to say, let's talk about the...
I'll mention a little bit. So
we'll get back to that. Go on.
It was, if anyone's familiar, Geoffrey Chaucer was one of like the most, at least nowadays, remembered medieval authors. So the Canterbury Tales is a bunch of pilgrims like telling each other. It's like a framework, right? So there's another work called, at least 2 out of 3 articles, I believe, mention this work called the Decameron, which is specifically, I believe, of Florentine. I believe it's out of Italy in like the 1400s when the plague was hitting there, where a group of people flee the city, and in order to distract themselves, or at least take themselves away from the tragedy of what's happening, tell a bunch of tales.
Yeah, very much like
pretty
Chaucer.
much that, right? Yeah. So it's like, a collection of some are bawdy, some, but for the most part, they're meant to be uplifting, or at least, I know I said distracting, but like something to remind you of the good of life, the positivity of life, versus in the face of such a pandemic. So yeah, like that is one of the ones that is remembered and still persists throughout history, like it based upon a similar framework of Chaucer of the Canterbury Tales.
Yes.
And there's also just a little side note that like I since I learned about the Decameron, I found it kind of interesting.
Did you not know about it? Like I heard of it, Steve-O, but I'd never read it. Like I knew it existed though.
Not super recently, but like
Familiar
after
with it?
school.
Okay.
Like I never heard about it in school, but like
We're lucky we didn't do this first, because I would have forced us all to read the Decameron.
I was actually going to say, and I was actually going to say I have a reading movie idea for this summer.
Okay.
Is it Little Hours? And I was just about to mention Little Hours.
I knew you were going to, so I didn't want to see your thunder.
There's a movie with Aubrey Plaza, Alison Brie, and Kate McCucci, and a couple other great actors. Dave Franco's in it.
Nick
Offerman's in it. Called The Little Hours, and it is based very, very loosely on the Decameron, and it's so bizarre, but it is absolutely hilarious.
Well, sounds cool.
Definitely
We'll
check it
mark
out.
Yeah, I think we should read the Decameron and watch the Little Hours do a crossover there.
Sure. But anyway, I'm saying that's the framework of the Decameron, as you said. Like so, like it's a known work that specifically has that as a framework and utilize that as its narrative. So,
It's fascinating to me how often later works where they are facing a new type of disease, whether it be cholera or smallpox, reference the Black Plague as kind of the epitome of disease,
the focal point of like,
and they also referenced Mask of the Red Death, from Poe, which comes later. But all referencing the Black Death, even though they were in essence referencing their current state of things. So
yeah, exactly. There's always that like take your current state, look back at like the worst time that you could possibly have, and kind of like mesh the two of them. That's definitely like Mask of the Red Death is just a combination of that. I think
even if we skip forward to the 1940s with Camus' The Plague, that's referencing the Black Death as well, even though it's either Nazism or cholera. It's actually
depending on the reading you
discussing.
get of it, but like that both works. But yeah, it certainly like uses like looks backwards, but also brings it into the present to of course commentate upon what's happening in the contemporary to when it was produced.
Yeah, and I think for sure, like you look at something like a book we just read, I Am Legend, and that's definitely pulling from like trying to have a modern take on like old works. Like
just like we did with Dr. Wise, I would like to get a little bit discuss zombie fiction, but if we can jump back to Dr. Wise for a second.
Let's go. Yeah, let's go to the 1918.
1918, the Great War is happening and the Spanish influenza is happening concurrently. And it's fascinating that Western governments, and I'm sure other governments, but this was mostly focused from the BFI, were actually suppressing, because film was a new form of entertainment coming out, both newsreels and films based on the Spanish flu, not to panic their citizenry while the war was going on. So we actually saw one of the few remaining videos that came out in 1919 after the war had ended, based upon how to handle the Spanish influenza, called Dr. Wise and Influenza. And I thought it was fascinating how much hasn't changed in 101 years. So would anyone like to discuss...
Yeah, so I'll throw it out real quick. It's basically like an older, like what you think of as an old wise doctor, like a lot of the title, and him like sort of breaking down facts, like, hey, if you're sick and you're coughing, don't go to work. You might spread it. It's basically like again a 15 minutes.
It's a PSA,
Yeah.
It's exactly the best way to describe it, right? So it's like giving you like the actual like the medical facts they knew. Like, here's how to make a mask if you must be in contact with someone. Wear a mask. Here's how to do it, right?
Flush your nose and gargle your throat if you're feeling sick.
I'm not saying it's not sound precautionary advice, and as you said, like it's sort of somewhat maybe amusing. Like not much has changed because that's how to prevent the spread of germs. Like I'm not sure what else.
Yeah, now we're on the internet. Like, here's how to make a mask. All right.
Yeah.
But there are some differences, which I would definitely love to point out as well.
Well,
ahead.
please.
There is nothing about washing your hands in
Yep.
this. People who, like, even in the instances where they, like, give the person credit for not engaging with somebody who's sick, they, like, shake hands in that scene. Like,
Yeah,
I was like, no.
I did notice that.
Well,
Steve.
one must put politeness over
Yeah.
common safety.
Of course.
Especially because it's a British news.
No, there are certainly things that have been learned since then.
Sure.
Of course, but yeah, it is crazy how for the most part it's pretty much the same advice. It's like, hey, if you deal with somebody who's sick, wear a mask. If you're, if you find someone who seems to be sick, don't hang around them. If you're sick, don't go indoors and like interact with people.
Would you say
It's
Steve,
simple stuff that like really affects how viruses and sicknesses in general spread. 1918, like there were some cities and states and things that did like pretty solid lockdowns. Now a lot of them didn't because, like you said, there was a lot of suppression of like what was really going on. But like I think it was St. Louis, like Philadelphia had a parade, and St. Louis locked down on like the same day.
It's Armistice Day,
of course
baby.
it is.
And Philadelphia had like this huge death toll, and St. Louis kept it pretty under control. So, I mean, it just goes to show you that it's the same shit. Like, we figured out how to stop this a while ago. It's hard to get people to listen,
If I may, germ warfare never changes.
Or nationalism kills. I mean, since it was
Perhaps Dr. Fauci should be putting out
News
Dr.
Girls.
Fauci and influenza.
The wise Dr. Fauci. That's what that's what the new one should be.
the yeah. Wow, there's so much to unpack there. Like, just getting into immediately, my mind went to all the dissenters. And so Dr. Fauci, Dr. Wise Fauci would have to actually have a second video that says to the deniers of this is not disrupting your freedoms. This is,
I wish I had my Fauci shirt on. It says, listen to Fauci, stand your couchy.
I've been waiting for you to wear that.
Fascinating is at that time the disease spread because of government control and lockdown over spread of information. Now it might be argued that there's too much spread of information and that you can find people online who agree with your batshit crazy beliefs and continue forward with that. And I don't know. I just found that interesting. As you were talking, Chris, I was thinking about that.
yeah, I'm really not going to open this can of worms that I was going to.
I just opened it, so
That's
please.
fair. But I mean, like,
No, I was just going to say,
valid, buddy. So yeah.
no, I was just going to say Dr. Fauci would have to I guess it would be suppressed by the government if Dr. Fauci would have put out a video like social distance, something about, not marching on state houses with armed weapons,
Yeah, hey.
I feel like anybody who thinks that it's okay to march on state house with armed weapons is not going to listen to any doctor about anything.
No matter
But
what.
they might listen to Dr. Wise. So on that note,
well, yeah.
let us move on to modern.
One thing
day.
actually, there's one thing I was going to say before I got derailed. Was that the one thing I noticed was everybody was carrying pocket hankies.
Yeah.
And I used to,
That's just what
every
you do
year,
in 1992.
in my stocking for Christmas, I'd get a thing of pocket hankies. And like
Back
to me,
in
it always-
1919.
no, like my
Back when
grandparents,
Christmas was alive.
my grandfather always like had a pocket hanky, and they were they always grossed
They're
me
so
out.
fucking gross. My grandfather did the same thing. He was just like blow his nose, put it in his pocket. I was like, that's
Like, it's-
disgusting.
well,
You're gonna
let me
blow your
tell-
nose on that
I
same
think it's
thing
a
like
thing of-
20 minutes from now.
I think
Well, let me tell you something. I found a good use for them when I was in high school. They didn't really last all that long, but
Whoa, okay.
Hold on.
Anyway.
All right, so modern day. Actually, so I think that their argument for zombies in these is fascinating. It's something that I didn't consider beforehand that it is actually the personification of disease, giving a face to it in
I mean,
a certain
we touched on
extent.
that in our
Yeah, but like,
reviews,
but I think it actually drove home with looking at past artwork where they added demons or they added gods as the actors behind disease. Now we've given a more scientific approach to perceiving a visual representation of the spread of disease.
Well, like you look at werewolves, vampires, zombies, they spread their disease with a bite, any kind of bodily fluid exchange, depending upon your mythology. So, I mean, it's not just, werewolves, are also, a plague.
Well, I mean,
Be
that was
disease.
when, the other thing is, like, that was when if you got chlamydia, you were going to fucking go nuts and, like, literally your brain chemistry would change.
Oh, I know.
You
I
remember.
know. Yeah.
But like, yeah, like I feel like that was kind of a reaction to that type of thing where it's like, oh, this person became a different person because of this disease, and I feel like that happened a lot in terms of that type of stuff.
But I thought it was just fascinating that we had to that each generation has had to give its own face to this unknown monster of disease
I
to
do
personify
find that
it.
like interesting as well because like again, we discuss it throughout like as a thread throughout the previous month of virus related pandemic related things that we discussed pop culture wise. But yeah, I mean like it's almost unavoidable. In fact, I would say because that's what humanity like the human psyche needs to put some kind of label, if you will, like upon that to deal with it.
So one point I forgot to mention is that with the end of the kind of religious symbolism behind that, but before the scientific, I think art often focused on the artist himself and the self-reflection and how it was personifying disease through the individual. And I thought that was a fascinating, especially in like self-portraits or family portraits, showing that thing.
Yeah, there were a couple of really interesting self-portraits in the article, How Art Has, what was it?
Yeah, may I bring one up while you look it up?
What Plague Art Tells Us About Today. And it was, I mean, sure. Go ahead, Scott.
So, I mean, I'm a big fan of Edward Munch, who did The Scream, which you probably, anyone listening might be familiar with. You guys probably are. Probably like, the guy, like the sort of amorphous human.
Hold on, Scott. You're really low. Your volume's really low.
How about now?
Better. Yeah.
Yeah. So Edward Munch was famous for that portrait, but he did a self-portrait when he had the flu, and like of course it's a similar style, and like it's a way for the artist to like it has a similar like sort of you can almost see the strain coming off of the painting itself, and he painted himself when he was in the throes of dealing with the disease as a way to get himself through it. And I found that fascinating as well. Like there's another artist. I'm sorry, did not write down the name, but he did a family self-portrait in which they all had as what I believe is also it was the flu.
Egon Schiele.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
I'm looking
So there was that one too, which is quite fascinating. Like again, the introspection of artists who are producing art in about and around this this topic.
That one is brutal because that was like the in 1918 pandemic, and his wife and their unborn child who he depicted in the painting all died.
Exactly, man. It's harsh. Yeah.
Before she had the child, and like that's wild. Like to have a piece of art like that,
Mm-hmm. Well, I know they referenced the photograph by, and I'm going to get his name wrong, but it's Dave Wojnarowicz. He actually took a photograph of himself, buried in the desert.
Oh yeah, that's right. That was fascinating.
Keith Haring, because I was actually looking up. I wasn't ignoring you guys when I was listening. I was trying to find Keith Haring. I believe he himself, when he is diagnosed, did kind of a self-portrait where he was naked. It's a black white picture. He's naked in his living room, and I think I believe it is him. It's kind of more along the Day of the Dead kind of makeup.
Well, that's you're talking about. You're both of these are further on in the timeline, right?
Yeah. I'm sorry. Am I jumping ahead?
No. It's all right to jump there, but we need to make it clear. Yeah, I think.
Sorry about that.
So yeah, that's the AIDS epidemic.
And Well, actually, Chris, do you have anything further to say about that?
About the self-portraits
the portrait,
about
yeah.
the 80s.
Yeah.
Because I'll wait till we get their timeline.
Well, we're kind of at their timeline.
No. I'll let you lead it when we get to AIDS or whatever. I'll get.
Well, we didn't read this article, but I did when searching for things. There's an interesting thing about the Dallas Buyers Club and how it was a straight person's viewpoint on a LGBTQ issue, and how in a sense cultures co-opt tragedies for smaller groups and as analysis, but that I don't think fit in with our greater topic, what we're discussing
it's
here.
Tangential exploration, but it's certainly there.
But I think that personal viewpoint that you mentioned, Chris, is I think what more important art to come out of this kind of suffering.
Well, because it does, yeah, exactly. Because who better to tell a story that's not being listened to, and in fact being suppressed because of Southern strategy, moral reasons, and because a lot of times we say, well, what could the government do? Like in the 90s, I heard, well, what could have Reagan done? What could have Reagan done? Well, guess what? Now that this thing is this COVID-19 thing, and we're reading these articles, and a lot of things that were coming back to me like quicker than I can like take notes on it. In that, like, it doesn't change. I mean, there's always a reason to suppress what's going on because there's always another you can point at.
Yeah, so like I don't have anything to follow that directly with Chris, but I do have a note that I'm not sure where else to bring it up, so I'll bring it up now. It was from the art of making art about plagues, where it's maybe ties in a bit to the Dr. Wise thing in a sense. So it's America, of course, doesn't likes to see themselves be the victor. So they cannot really be the victor in the traditional sense versus a plague or a pandemic. Mm-hmm. So that sort of like, because of that angle, societal mindset, I guess I want to say, that's why you may not see as much art like depicting it, because they cannot be depicted as such in that position when that circumstance happens. So like they're reluctant to do that, to produce artworks that in fact, encapsulate that.
I also think that's why we as a culture tend to elevate individuals in this thing. So Dr. Fauci, as an example, and not to say that he's doing a good job with the whole thing, but we want to have a hero for the thing. And he was a hero of the AIDS epidemic, arguably to a certain extent. And he's the current face of the thing. But we need a face. We need a I think Americans desire that hero.
Yeah, I think
not Andrew Cuomo.
Yeah, I'm just saying, like the article pointed it out, and I thought it was like an interesting little.
To many people, Andrew Cuomo, unfortunately.
I'm sorry, guys. I'm really angry today, so I'm trying to mitigate my.
I understand, but Chris, to your point, like people like as Ian said want to like have that face there, so like they'll put him there, whether or not you agree with his like general policies overall. It's the point remains that people feel as if they need a figurehead, I guess I want to say.
Yeah, it's really funny, Ian, getting back to something you say about wanting America to be the victor. And I was just looking it up. There's a book from the late 80s, early 90s called And the Band Played On by Randy Schultz. And I was never able to finish the book because it just upset me way too much. But I did see the movie, and there was a pissing contest going on between some of the doctors in the United States because the doctors in France were making greater strides, and the doctors got pissy when certain people were sharing their work.
Yeah.
And then, in the fact that like AIDS had more in common with feline leukemia. So, you had these doctors having to, their degrees didn't, their American doctoral degrees didn't mount to much when they were getting help from the French and from the veterinary. But they're like altruism. It's just amazing how subjective altruism is.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, go on, Steve.
Well, I just kind of, it's really interesting to see. Like, it is there is like a whole lot of interesting art that comes out of pretty much every one of these, world-changing epidemics, pandemics, whatever. And that, you know, the AIDS epidemic was no different in terms of that.
Sure.
I don't know. I didn't have too much more to say about it. I think you guys said a lot of what I was gonna bring up, but yeah. I just wanted to,
Yeah, so like I mean we touched on it earlier, but I think maybe it's like as we maybe wind down, but as you mentioned, perhaps we were conjecturing that in the wake of this, we will see artworks that use maybe the Spanish influenza because it's the most recent epidemic that's similar to what's happening. That isn't like it's not going to be commenting on the actual COVID stuff, but it will use that as a framework. But perhaps maybe next maybe Academy's season, you know, like many Academy films, maybe again just purely speculation, purely speculation.
Oh, certainly.
Maybe a few of them will use that as a framework to tell a story about, you know, the reaction to the actual present condition.
I'm actually going to go beyond that because I was thinking about as we had this discussion that there is kind of like a sine wave almost between either looking back in history for metaphors or individualism. And will it be individualistic art that comes out of this? Which I can see very much so as well, considering culture. I'll look back at the 1918, which is we're already doing a lot of analysis I see about COVID-19 because that's our most immediate thing. Yeah, or will we even look back further to the prime example of the Black Plague? We'll see that, and which of those kind of arts will come through. So I think those are the three options you have for art to come out of this.
I just want to throw out one more like nerdy-ish thing. While the Black Plague from Europe is remembered like to this day, there were plagues hit London in like the 1650s, like something like that, like pretty badly over the course of 10, 15 years. That's hard. Like that's a very underexplored avenue. I'm just saying.
Well, I've been reading about this recently, just strangely because I'm reading Bill Bryson's book about Shakespeare, and like London was the most dangerous city, like in
Thames, man.
like Europe, you know, that everybody still wanted to go to. The only reason that London was growing was because people were flocking there, despite the fact that, like, you know, 7% of their population died from disease every year. But yeah, they had like outbreaks of smallpox and the Black Plague for like every fucking year, basically. And it like
exactly. I just wanted to mention that
crazy. You know,
cool.
it's wild.
Not cool, but it's interesting that coinciding that you encountered that, Steve. Because I'm just saying, I wanted to point that out, that it's a very often forgotten and not really like pointed out fact that was, you know, in between the main, again, the Middle Ages Black Death that everyone knows and remembers. The bubonic plague still resurfaced like throughout, like way later.
I mean, it still resurfaces in America.
I was going to say 1,000 cases of like bubonic plague a year.
No,
you know.
So, Steve-O, I'm Larry King. You too little or too much?
What?
Cases of bubonic plague.
Too little or too much cases of bubonic plague. Too little to make anybody care, and too much for my liking to be in the world anymore.
Good answer, sir.
I like it.
There's something else I was looking up in the Vanity Fair article, aside from the fact that I was chuckling about the Joe Biden Will and Grace thing. They were talking about oh dear, where'd it go? About parts of our culture, parts of the world that we don't normally see, that normally like they were talking about, like being in the rural area and not having any gay friends while AIDS was going on. And it's so funny now because I have excuse me, it is really interesting to see the levels of privilege and because, all right, so you've always got the celebrity elite tweeting like, oh, you know, blah, blah, blah from my jacuzzi or whatever. But you have people who are like, all right, I'm just going to say it. So you have white people saying, oh my God, I was walking down the street and these people walked on the other side of the street. It's just like, okay, you do know that doesn't, for some people, that has never, ever ended. And it's funny to see how aghast people are once you have something that is affecting large populations, small populations, different parts of the world, where we have to have different kind of rules where people who normally have social norms where they don't have to worry about day in and day out, all of a sudden everybody's a pariah to everybody else, and it's just a matter of public safety. And all of a sudden people are aghast at the fact, like, oh my God, people won't come near me, they don't want to talk to me, they turn their head when they, it's just like, really?
Yeah.
Well, to be fair, I'm used to that. But
welcome to society.
Anyway, are there any other topics you wanted to discuss that I might have glossed over?
No, I think we covered it pretty well. Yeah, I know it's sort of a mishmash of stuff, but good, Sivo.
Other than, I think it's always like when you're in the middle of something, it's hard to talk about it in the same way as we've talked about like all the rest of these. I know we've touched on the COVID.
No, it's over, man.
Pandemic.
I was going to say we should actually do some follow-ups on this, like, just to kind of. I'm being serious because I was reading
I'm
these
certainly
articles.
producing no art for.
Yeah, me neither. Unfortunately,
I'm producing art, but nothing's plague related.
I wish I was, but some people are doing some good stuff right now.
I'm working on a loose electronic music concept album, but
hey,
plague theme is all
that's art.
A soundtrack for a movie that doesn't exist, but yeah.
That sounds like the apocalypse to me.
Yeah,
To answer your question, I think we covered it pretty well. Like, granted, we covered a lot of eclectic things here and there, but it all it's a conglomerate of a mismatch, a soup, if you will, societal mindsets and art being produced in the wake, in the face of facing such a, like you said, Zivo, an epidemic / pandemic. And you're right, like, we probably won't be able to process it really until it's actually like quote unquote like over, like that the immediate danger has passed and we get the all clear and stuff. But until that point, I think it is going to be interesting to see what does come down the pipeline from mainstream and also independent artists. So.
One thing, you are going to post the links to these articles because the Guardian article.
I remember, yeah.
The Guardian article I thought was fine, but the BBC article and the Vanity Fair article, in addition to Dr. Wise's movie, really, I really recommend this. Since this isn't Mott's, we're not really recommending them. That if you're listening to this, please go and read these articles. And definitely, the movie is fun, but the BBC and the Vanity Fair, in my opinion, they all do, but more so the latter, have so many topics of conversation. We touched upon them, but there's so much that can be. We
didn't even go into how superhero films are doomed to die because of coronavirus.
Damn.
That will be an episode later.
We have to do that as an episode later because
should they die? We definitely talk about that.
Snyder Cut's coming next year, so
maybe that'll be the death of them.
Chris, that's a disease unto itself, which is again a separate topic.
I think what we're really trying to say here is that if you support the furtherment of art in society, you should infect everyone possible. I'm Jonathan Ian Manzer, here with Scott Thola.
I shall return to disease.
Stephen Hermosi.
Yeah, I'm need to don my plague mask.
And Christopher Morgan.
I have to get vaccinated for the DC flu. Indeed. Take your definition on DC.
Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to The Lost Signals discusses philosophy, narrative, and the mechanics of criticism. Editing and engineering by Jonathan Ian Manzer. Music by Christopher Morgan. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.